Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Red Lettuce. We have with us a very special guest. Dan Cohen is a journalist. He does all kinds of really fancy journalisty work, and we are so excited to have him on to talk about current happenings in Colombia and Palestine. Welcome, Dan. Could you tell our viewers a little bit about you, real quick, and where they can find your work?
Hey guys, good to be back with you. I am a correspondent in Washington D.C., or beautiful nation's capital, for Behind the Headlines, like an online platform, a web platform. I do YouTube videos and write articles and just working on documentaries and this sort of thing. Um, and you can follow me at Dan Cohen 3000 on Twitter and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Behind the Headlines. I think it's called. It's called. Just look up Behind the Headlines with Dan Cohen. Follow that. You're set.
Yeah, and speaking of that, we caught your latest video on Colombia, and we highly recommend people to go watch that after this video. We're going to link it into the description. So I guess we should really start with what's going on in Colombia. In your video, you point out that the tax reforms was only just the trigger for the deep discontent among the masses. So let's dive deeper into the material conditions that are the root cause of the national strike and the violent repression by the US-backed narco puppet government against the people. Also, tell us about who the neo-Nazi is that's advising the government on how to break the national strike.
Yeah. Well. Yeah. So let's talk about the national strike. I think is a good point to jump off. Basically, the president Ivan Duque, far right guy, ally of the United States, has tried to force a tax reform proposal, meaning austerity measures, down the throats of the Colombian people. And Colombia is in deep, deep crisis economically, financially, politically, socially, for a number of reasons. Now, economically, the country was already, large swaths of it were already in poverty, basically as a result of neoliberalism, of, basically of giving away its sovereignty in order to have, access to international capital. It's controlled by the United States. And through the COVID-19 pandemic, it's only exacerbated. So you have 43% of the country in poverty, according to the Colombian government's own statistics, 15% in extreme poverty. So, what does that look like? Um, you have people who can't eat a meal more than once every couple days, starvation. You have, mass unemployment. And so, with this kind of crisis, then the government says we need more money from the public, not only from poor people, but also from the middle class too. It's they can't handle anymore, and so that became a trigger for a national strike organized by the country's biggest labor unions, by student groups, but really everyone I've talked to says that this is different from previous years because it's the youth who are leading it, and it's not everything is organized. It's a lot of it is very spontaneous, and there's just so much frustration that people are just pouring out into the streets in different cities. The biggest hotbed has been Cali, which is has some of the in the population centers has some of the worst um, unemployment. I mean, it really actually reminds me of the U.S. The figures I read in a lot of ways, where it's like young people don't have a future. They can, if they go to university, they come out saddled with huge amounts of debt. They don't have any prospects to get a job, to be able to have a family or any kind of normal life. And I mean, that's this kind of brutal reality that people are dealing with. And so you have this triggered a major protest movement and a strike. And since it began, there have been a number of reasons that it has grown. More complaints have been kind of added on. One of which is the systematic unfulfillment of the 2016 peace accord between the government and the leftist guerrilla movement known as the FARC. After 52 years of civil war, the FARC and the government made an agreement that would basically radically transform the country, um, and address a lot of this major inequality. In rural areas where there's just no services from the government. It's basically totally abandoned by the government. The only interaction they have with the state is from the military. Um, there's a huge amount of coca and cocaine coming out of Colombia. And the people who grow that are in extreme poverty. They're barely subsisting. The only way they can survive is to grow coca. But it's illegal. So it would um, basically transform the farmer situation, where these people would actually own land instead of it all being concentrated in the hands of a tiny elite. That through the years, people have been expelled from their land by right-wing paramilitaries connected to the government and the state and drug cartels and international business. It would put the land back in people's hands. So it was really, I think you could say revolutionary in a lot of ways, this peace accord, in many, many ways. And so the FARC agreed to do this. They laid down their weapons. They agreed to reintegrate into society. And the government did not hold up its end of the bargain. A small percentage of the peace accords have been implemented. And not only did it not implement it, the government has immediately, after the peace accord was signed, began to exterminate ex-combatants and social leaders. So since the signing of the peace accord in 2016, there have been about 1,150 approximately social leaders assassinated, and there have been 248 ex-combatants assassinated. So this is an extermination campaign, basically sponsored by the government, carried out by right-wing paramilitaries and intelligence, um, that death squads, um, and people are extremely frustrated with that. Basically, the government of under Ivan Duque, who came to power in 2018, has sought to destroy the peace accord, and the United States, both the Trump administration and the Biden administration now, have encouraged that, done everything they can to destroy the peace accord. So that's another major reason. One of the parts of the peace accord that's also been attacked is in 2015, I believe, or 16, the government stopped spraying glyphosate, which is like Roundup weed killer, on coca plants around the country. That was one of the pillars of what was called Plan Colombia, a massive military aid package that began actually at the very end of the Clinton administration, went through the Bush administration, through the Obama administration, and transformed into what they called Peace Colombia with the peace accord, even though the military aid continued. So as part of Peace Colombia, the spraying of glyphosate, this toxic chemical that's just weed killer on coca crops in rural areas, was stopped. And it was never effective, and it only poisoned people, poisoned land, poisoned water, and made farmers extremely angry at the government. So now last year, the Trump administration said, you should resume doing this. And the Biden administration has agreed. The State Department under Biden has said, yes, Colombia needs to resume spraying poison on farmers. When I was in Colombia back in December, there was a lot of hope. This is right after Biden had won. There was a lot of hope that Biden would represent, a kind of return to some new sane policy, would go back to like the Obama administration, pushing for a peace accord and now implementing that peace accord. But as far as I can see, the real interest of the United States was for the FARC to disarm, it was to put down their weapons. Now that that's been done, it's back to business as usual. They can kill them and carry on with business, so there's no armed resistance. Um, so that's another major frustration, particularly of the farmers, like in that I spoke to in rural areas and where I went and visited back in December. Um, so those are like some of the big reasons people are protesting, and the response from the state has been just iron fist, has been to shoot and kill protesters, has been to call on paramilitaries to come and kill protesters. Um, and so what I found, I mean, this was reported in Colombian media widely, but totally ignored in US media until I showed it, is that back in February, the Colombian government, the police and military, brought in a neo Nazi from Chile to basically explain how to understand and how to defeat what an uprising that he said was inevitable. And indeed, it was inevitable. And he gives this kind of like gobbledygook postmodern framework called the Dissipated Molecular Revolution, that basically says that a bunch of disparate groups ranging from the ETA, Basque separatist movement that no longer really exists in Spain, over the last 3+ decades, has worked with the Chavez movement and the Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path in Peru, and like a bunch of groups that like are not connected at all. And it's also like this kind of crazy anti-Semitic um, belief, and it all starts with, like he says, like some French Jews. It's really just a bonkers kind of right wing kind of fascistic conspiracy theory of a international communist conspiracy that has no class dimension, of course, as it's postmodern, and the only way to defeat it is with killing. And so about a few days into this whole uprising, the former president of Colombia, who's still the most powerful guy, Alvaro Uribe, he tweeted about the this dissipated molecular revolution, and said that this is what's happening. And so it's resonated with the most powerful man who basically in Colombia, which he controls, Ivan Duque. He's the puppet master. And so it really like kind of explains what the ideology is behind assassinating all these unarmed protesters. That's essentially what's going on.
Yeah, and maybe we can also talk about, because a lot of people hear that that line that the Colombian government is a narco puppet government of the United States. So, how exactly did the drug cartel take over the state of Colombia?
Well, basically, the drug cartels have existed in Colombia for a few decades. I think basically since the 70s, and since then their power has been ascendant. You can really chart the rise of the power of the drug cartels through the career of Alvaro Uribe. In 1980, Uribe was appointed as the head of like the civil aviation affairs for the government, after the guy who was in that position was assassinated because he said he was not going to work with the drug cartels. He was going to be against them. So Uribe is put in this position. Immediately, a bunch of cartels are given passes or given licenses to fly their planes, with coke to deliver it to Central America and then onto the United States and Europe. From there, his career basically took off, he became very close with Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel, and the Ochoa brothers, who were also part of the Medellin cartel. Um, he then, basically, long story short, over the decades, um, he advanced his career, and even in the drug cartels and politically, and even the U.S. government knew that Uribe was a narco. There was a 1991 Defense Intelligence Agency memo that identified Uribe as the number 82 most important drug trafficker in Colombia. Now, um, number 82 is not that high, but the thing is, it's an elected official,
Right.
and who's on the rise, who's becoming more and more powerful. Um, so he became the governor of the Department of Antioquia, and basically he was on the payroll of the narcos, and through the 2000s, in 2002, he became president. A few years later, there was a huge scandal where very many people around him, including his cousin, were found to be on the payroll of narcos. Where I think a third of the Colombian Congress was found to be in bed with drug cartels. It's called parapolitica, um, and so this was all, this has all been known. And then in 2000, last year, basically there was another huge scandal of Duque and Uribe being in bed with a drug trafficker named Ñeñe Hernandez. Ñeñe Hernandez was a kind of the public face of a drug trafficking cartel um, and a financial arm. He was known as a rancher, and was in high society and everything, and he went to Brazil and was assassinated. He was murdered in a kind of um unclear instant, in under unclear circumstances that it seems like the government is basically covering up. And so he turned out he was under investigation by the police and the United States, and then um, there was an investigation. This investigation, there was an investigation done by a Colombian journalist named Gonzalo Guillen, who revealed that this guy, this is a narco, and that he led a campaign to buy votes using stolen money
Mm.
for Duque. And this was ordered by Uribe. So you have the most powerful politician in Colombia ordering a drug trafficker, a murderous, violent drug trafficker, who's the face of one of the most of a cartel that controls basically Colombia's Caribbean coast, ordering this guy to basically buy the election for his man. Um, and that's what happened. It's not clear, it's not 100% certain that those votes that they bought were, or what made the difference between Duque's win or not. But um, this has been there have been complaints submitted to the highest legal authorities in Colombia, and they don't go anywhere. I've interviewed these journalists, and they just tell me that the the cartels control the government, so they don't go anywhere. They just sit. Um, so, Colombia is a narco state. And not only is it a narco state, it's not only, kind of illegal business, but it's also above board business that, so you have international corporations, American and Canadian mining and oil and, gold corporations that are pillaging wealth from Colombia, and they are also supporting these extreme right wing politicians. And so this cocaine production and just mining and oil production go hand in hand, and it's kind of created this ultra right wing fascistic um, political phenomenon that in Colombia they call uribismo, like Uribism, which sounds funny in English, um, but with this guy Alvaro Uribe as the master politician.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic because this is our media tries to paint Maduro as this type of figure.
Right. Right. I mean, everything they say about Colombia is just total projection. I'm
Mhm.
sorry, everything they say about Venezuela is total projection of Colombia. That it's a narco dictatorship, and of course there's drug trafficking, in Venezuela to some degree, but that doesn't mean that there is uh that it's like linked to the state.
Mhm.
So
Yeah,
I mean
well,
it's yeah, go ahead.
the media used that talking point about how Venezuelans were fleeing the evil communist dictator Maduro to seek refuge in Colombia. How does this current crisis kind of contradict this lie? But also, does the IMF play a role in the economic crisis currently unraveling in Colombia? I
Yeah,
know those
well,
are kind of two different things, but
right. Well, I mean, all of this is a result of neoliberal capitalism. That is the system, and so it's not a matter of getting rid of the hard right wing president and
Hmm.
going back to, like, a more, uh, the guy who was in before, who made the peace deal and this kind of thing, because none of them are going to honor it, and ultimately it just will bring in a more right wing figure. It's just like, oh, so we got rid of Trump, who, like, everyone said was a fascist, and now we went back to the thing that produced Trump. It's kind of the same thing here. You can't just, like, turn the dial back a little bit on the same exact thing.
exactly.
Um,
I agree with that.
and so, I mean, the dynamic between Colombia and Venezuela, of course, what we discussed, the demonization of Venezuela and the projection of all the problems of Colombia onto Venezuela. And you do have, Venezuelan migrants who have who have left the country and gone to Colombia, and basically as a passing point to go to other countries, or to, I met Colombians working in, like, basically cocaine factories. Or, I'm sorry, I met Venezuelans working in cocaine factories in Colombia. um but the reality is, this is straight up because the United States destroyed their economy. The United Nations has made it clear. I mean, this is proven that U.S. sanctions have destroyed 99% of the Venezuelan economy, have reduced its income by 99%. So, facing that, it's remarkable that the government actually survived, and that, there aren't more people dead. I mean, in 1 year, in a 1 year period from 2017 to 2018, U.S. sanctions killed, according to the Center for Policy and Economic Research, killed 40,000 people in Venezuela. Um, so, they're genocidal. They've just 99% of the economy. That's the entire economy. Well, I mean, well, I don't,
Yeah.
so, I mean, people, of course, people are going to leave the country.
Right.
Also, what they don't tell us is that there are many Colombians who have gone to Venezuela to seek refuge and to try to survive there. So both of the countries are are in crisis, um, because of neoliberal imperialism.
Mhm.
Venezuela, because of um, economic sanctions and warfare, and despite its socialist system that has still managed to provide, boxes of food in its CLAP program, um, and, housing and this sort of thing, and, you know because and in Colombia, because of imperialism and neoliberalism. And so, um, that's the fundamental problem in both of these countries. And the U.S. is, not only are U.S. corporations making huge amounts of money in Colombia itself, but Colombia is a platform for the United States. It's such a geostrategically significant and important, um, piece of land, because not only does it connect the Atlantic and the Pacific through the Caribbean, but it allows the U.S. to control the region. So basically all of the destabilization and regime change plots against Venezuela have been run through Colombia. Um, and also against Ecuador too. During the recent Ecuadorian election, we saw that, the U.S. basically deployed the Colombian Attorney General um, to Ecuador in order to come up with some lies that the socialist candidate Andres Arauz was linked to the guerrilla groups, left-wing guerrilla groups in Colombia, the ELN, which is called the National Liberation Army, which is totally false. But they just lied, to try to discredit this guy and say he's in bed with terrorists in Colombia. Um, so that's Colombia. People have to understand what a huge role Colombia plays in U.S. imperialism in Latin America and the Caribbean, and it's able to project so much power, and that's why Colombia is just stuck in this horrible situation, and hopefully something can come out of these protests, but it's really not clear where it's going to go, but it's not stable, and you have the Colombian government just basically trying to force the population to accept this tax reform down the barrel of a gun, and people simply can't, and so they're just basically trying to kill the protesters, especially young people in the streets, to try to get them to just accept their future of misery and destitution.
Dan, so there's a lot happening today. There's a lot going on in Palestine right now as well. Um, and I hope that we can talk a little bit about that before you have to go. But something that really has bothered me is that people point to Venezuela and all of the Venezuelans who left to Colombia for refuge during the height of their economic crisis as a sign of like human rights abuse and stuff like that. Um, and they say, oh look, all the like so many Venezuelans have left, like the government's a failure, the socialism doesn't work, blah, blah, blah. But I don't see that happening with the Uyghur population in China. And as I'm scrolling through Twitter, I'm seeing hundreds of videos of Palestinians getting beaten in the streets by Israelis, by Israeli soldiers. They're being evicted from their homes. They're bombs are being dropped. Right, bombs are being dropped on them, and we see like Black Hawk helicopters in Colombia like firing at people in their homes, and this is all. These are all like this is evidence, right? This is tangible evidence that we can see. It's my understanding that the United States, particularly Joe Biden and his son, helped China with surveillance technology to spy on terrorists in Xinjiang. So if we helped give them technology to film terrorist activities, where's all the evidence that we should be able to see of genocide happening in Xinjiang, and how is this a distraction from what's happening in Palestine? Or Colombia, even.
Oh well, the evidence of the evidence of genocide in Xinjiang is it's with the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. It's right over there with those. I mean, I want to do, maybe I can do an impression of like an R2P liberal, looking for watching like Palestine, like Palestinian getting beaten, lynched in the street. Palestinian baby dead. Any Uyghurs here? Nope. Palestinian baby's brains on the sidewalk. No Uyghurs.
They don't care. They don't care about Muslims. Like I just don't like. Why should we believe that the United States cares about Muslims? From what we've seen happening to Palestinians, whenever they bring up Xinjiang, like I don't. I mean, it might be a reach for me to like compare the two situations, but I just have a really hard time believing that the U.S. cares about Arabs or Muslims. Period. Like I don't believe it. So I think what we see happening in Palestine kind of further exposes that. Do you agree with my thinking, or do you think I'm out of line?
No, I mean, it's so blatantly obvious. It's basically the US's relationship with Muslims is like this. Um, Empower the right wing of Muslims, the fanatical wing of Muslims, um, as a weapon of foreign policy, as a weapon of Western imperialism. Such as the Uyghur separatists, such as Al Qaeda in Syria, et cetera, et cetera. Meanwhile, um, regular everyday Muslims are killed by not only by those groups, but also, this is the perfect example in Israel and in Gaza. What Israel is doing, I mean, is that if you know, I mean, it's just beyond the pale. Um, we saw three towers in Gaza wiped out, three massive towers in Gaza wiped out in the last 24 hours by Israeli warplanes dropping bunker buster bombs. I spent one of those towers, the Sharuk Tower, is where I lived for about 3 out of the 7 months when I was in Gaza. It was really shocking to watch that. Um, I mean, that building houses, I don't know how many dozens of families. It's also the biggest media building in Gaza. Um, it's, I mean, the Israelis are saying, "Oh well, it's Hamas media," as if like because, and they're talking about Al Aqsa TV, the Al Aqsa channel, which is affiliated with Hamas, but simply because something is affiliated with a political party doesn't mean you can bomb it.
Yeah, right.
It's like, so does that mean the like Likud propagandists in Tel Aviv, it's like legit to like bomb an entire block where they're located, or like the Fox News is, or like because MSNBC is affiliated with the CIA, does that mean it's okay to like bomb MSNBC's headquarters? Like um so I mean, it's just like it's just terrorism. It's just state terrorism by the very basic definition. And it's times like this that it becomes clear. It's like the mask is off, the whole humanitarian mask of the U.S. empire. All these R2P liberals are just dead silent,
Yeah.
as
As
Israel
expected
just
of them, like,
reduces Gaza, yeah, to
yeah.
swaths of rubble, again,
Yeah.
as it has done again and again.
And it's
Yeah.
like
I think
they're already bombing rubble.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. They've already bombed that building. They bombed it in 2012, and they took out some offices, and a journalist had to have his leg amputated. I remember seeing that guy hobbling around, by the elevators. I mean, it's like it's just total impunity, and and then you have Israeli lynch mobs, you have Zionist lynch mobs terrorizing cities inside Israel where Palestinians remain, where where not all of them were ethnically cleansed in 1947, 1948. The few that remain are now being beaten in the streets by fascist Zionist lynch mobs carrying out pogroms. This is like, I mean, Israel has been in political crisis for a few years, unable to form a government. And now that crisis, basically because of Benjamin Netanyahu, you can actually trace all of this back to Benjamin Netanyahu's scandals. Basically, look at it this way. Netanyahu has four huge scandals that have threatened his political future. He's the longest serving prime minister in Israel's history, the quintessential Israeli politician. He, in order to protect himself from these scandals, he has brought in the ultra right wing of Zionism, of Israeli society. Basically, the openly, explicitly genocidal, fascistic wing of Zionism that is the the most powerful kind of element of the settler movement and is really leading the way in the settler movement. That's those settlers have been trying to take over these homes in Sheikh Jarrah, this East Jerusalem neighborhood, in occupied Jerusalem. Um, as a, in response to that, there have been mass Palestinian mobilizations and demonstrations, and those are centered around the Al-Aqsa compound. These Israeli fascists are also, not only are they trying to take over that neighborhood, they're trying to take over the Al-Aqsa compound because they want to destroy it and build a temple. So there have been so as Israel has used the pretext of these demonstrations and organizing around Al-Aqsa to crack down on them. And so there's been mass violence initiated by the Israelis at Al-Aqsa, and in response to that, Palestinian armed factions in Gaza launched rockets, basically because Al-Aqsa is the most sensitive site. It's the most important site religiously in the country for Palestinians, and also nationally. It is the kind of national icon of Palestine. There's nothing that can kind of awaken Palestinians like incursions into Al-Aqsa. And so then Israel uses the pretext of some rockets coming out to launch this devastating campaign of mass destruction. So all of this goes back basically in a lot of ways. I mean, it's a little bit arbitrary to call it at Netanyahu's corruption scandals, but in a lot of ways, him protecting himself by bringing these fascists in started this kind of latest escalation that has become what it is today, with thousands of Palestinians now homeless, and I think 52 dead, including 11 children, and several Israelis dead too.
Yeah, and you also you made the connection between Colombia and Israel and the type of relationship that they have. Why don't you go into that a little bit as well?
Well, both of them are, basically junior partners of the empire, of the U.S. empire, and have a lot of real similarities in terms of being ultra right wing kind of fascistic governments. Um, I have a piece coming out in the next day or two about um, there was a peace accord in the 1980s in Colombia, and um, a similar thing happened then. A party was created called the Patriotic Union that was basically a left wing party with former FARC guerrillas and communists and left wing people in general. And then there was an extermination campaign carried out against them. So for the next beginning in 1984, for about 20 years, there was something like 4,000 members of the Patriotic Union exterminated, murdered by paramilitaries and by the military itself. Um, there was an investigation in Colombia in January that came out that was never picked up in US media. So I basically wrote it up and took the investigation a little bit further. That it turns out that was ordered, this extermination of this left wing party was ordered by the president at the time, Virgilio Barco was his name, on upon advice from a top Israeli spy
Mm.
who he brought in to basically help him understand how can I prevent the rise of the left here in Colombia. And he basically told him, you just have these aren't his exact words. We don't know exactly what he said, but the evidence is all there. But basically advised him, you have to kill them. And he offered to do it. And the Colombian military was like, no, we're going to do it ourselves. And so that's what they did. And that began a long process of extermination. There's a really good documentary on the extermination of the Patriotic Union called El Baile Rojo in Spanish, which is the red dance in English. And there's a subtitled version on YouTube. That if you just look on YouTube, look up El Baile Rojo with English subtitles, you'll find it. It's a really powerful documentary, and it really helps kind of people to understand the left's relationship in Colombia with the state. And so that extermination campaign, went all the way up until like the the 2000s is when it was kind of officially considered over, and they had been so thoroughly exterminated that in 2002 they couldn't meet the electoral threshold for a party anymore. You had two presidential candidates assassinated. You had a bunch of mayors, like not only just the rank and file party members, but also big politicians. Um, and most of it went unpunished. Um, what's crazy, it gets even crazier. At the same time that extermination was going on, you had another Israeli, and this has been known, and Colombians know it very well. If you ask any Colombian leftist about the name Yair Klein, they know that this is a former Israeli counterterrorism soldier who became a mercenary, and he in the 80s did a series of trainings for Colombian paramilitaries. He is who basically helped create the most powerful paramilitaries through from the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and basically continue to exist to this day under different name. It was called the AUC, the United Self Defense Forces of Colombia, but they're just called the AUC. And they were basically, as brutal as you can imagine, carrying out the most extreme violence, beheading entire families, putting, their heads on the dinner plates to terrorize villages, um, dismembering people with chainsaws, this kind of thing. I mean, just beyond the most horrific stories. That was trained by an Israeli at the same time that the other Israeli was telling the president how to commit a genocide of the left. The extermination of the Patriotic Union was deemed a political genocide by a Colombian court. So that's the kind of background of the Israeli Colombian relationship, and that spy who advised the president on the genocide, he played a huge role in brokering a big arms deal between Israel and Colombia. So Colombia's air force today is primarily made up of Kfir, KFIR, Kfir warplanes that are from Israel, and this is the guy who brokered it. Is that
Wow.
genocide advisor? And under Duque, the current president, he has basically brought the Israel-Colombia relationship to new heights. He and Netanyahu, um, back in last September, when the massacres in Colombia, there, in addition to the extermination of social leaders and ex-combatants, there have been a lot of just massacres of various people. The massacres peaked in September of 2020 for the year, and that was the same month that Israeli special forces were training their Colombian counterparts. So, I can't help but wonder, does Israel have a role in the current extermination of social leaders and ex-combatants and massacres in Colombia? So, these two countries are not only similar, but they've had a kind of synergetic, if I can use like a corporate PR term, they've had like a synergetic relationship, in synergetically genocidal. Say that.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we're seeing it being displayed in front of the entire world, from Palestine to Colombia. And I think all this just underscores the fake outrage that we hear people claim to have, whether it's against Muslims in China, the so-called genocide that's happening there, or the human rights abuses, the so-called human rights abuses in Venezuela. But then we hear that these people say nothing about what's going on in U.S. puppet states like in Israel and in Colombia. So
There's a reason that we're being lied to. There's a reason that they would lie to you about the plight of Muslims in China. And I think it's important that we highlight this. And I think you're doing really important work, exposing what's imperialist bullshit in Colombia. So Dan, thank you so much for doing all of that, and thank you so much for your time. It seems we are all on limited time today, so we may have to reschedule and pick back up on this topic as it unravels. So we really appreciate your time. Thank you for coming on our show. Do you have any final thoughts?
Um, now just free Palestine, free Colombia, death
Absolutely.
to imperialism. Thank you guys a lot for having me. Always good to be on with you.
Hell yeah.
Thank you, Dan. We look forward to having you on again soon.
Looking forward to it.